Hey everybody, welcome to our next presentation series here at the World Urban Parks Congress. Thank you so much for joining us. I want to thank you for signing up for the presentation today. And if you've been interacting on our Whova app site, we have some really interesting ways for you to get connected with all of our participants and really learn some of the great things that are going out through parks around the world. Today, we're going to be hearing from Charles Neer. Charles is a senior associate with the WRT company. And I just want to tell you a little bit about his background before we get into his topic and presentation today. Charles Neer is a senior associate in ASLA, leading WRT's Parks and Open Space practice. His view of landscape as a productive agent in the shaping of cities, countrysides, and culture has been informed by more than 20 years of experience with national park master planning throughout the various sectors that he has worked in, really focusing on urban landscapes, waterfront, and greenway design. So we're very lucky to have him. I know this is going to be a very exciting presentation, and he's really going to give us a little bit more about the FDR Park, and how that flexible, and functional model has really worked well for that agency and that city, and really excited to hear about his focus and narratives on how design can really implement and better the park experience. So really excited for this presentation. It's going to be an interesting one, and I know that you will gain many insights. And again, just really want to thank you for being with us here today. So enjoy your presentation.
Hi everyone, my name is Charles Neer, and I'm a landscape architect and co-leader of the Parks and Open Space Practice Group with WRT Planning and Design in Philadelphia. First, I want to start by thanking everyone who's turning into this session, FDR Park, a resilient future for historic park. I'm really excited to be sharing this very impactful project with you today. It's a project that I've been leading for the past 2 years. And to let you all know that contrary to what a certain US politician has recently said, there are many good things that are happening in Philadelphia. And the future vision for FDR Park is certainly one of them. FDR Park is the city's only estuary park, an important bird area, and has been identified as a resiliency hub by the National Fish and Wildlife Foundation. Now, a resiliency hubs are defined as open spaces located near infrastructure and population density, where communities can maximize return on investment and achieve multiple community resilience and conservation outcomes. FDR is an important natural, cultural, and historic asset for the city. The FDR Park of the future is flexible and functional, a park that serves as a model for resilient design, showcasing low-impact development and green infrastructure projects, adapts to changing conditions, and is unified behind a community-supported vision. Today, in this presentation, I'm going to explore the nature-based solutions from the master plan that help balance the park's natural resources, hydrology, and programming for all users. I will discuss how the plan's resiliency goals and projected impacts of climate change are driving the park's implementation and ensuring that the park retains its recreational value while actively mitigating the impacts of a changing climate. I will start by explaining the park's context and community of users, then some of the challenges and stresses the park faces, and then I'll explain the key recommendations in the master plan. FDR is one of Philadelphia's most ecologically significant places, serving some of its most dense neighborhoods. Yet it has been relatively under-resourced since its development for the sesquicentennial nearly 100 years ago. Now, a sesquicentennial is the 150th anniversary, in this case, of the United States. As its infrastructure struggles to manage the effects of climate change and as demographics change and recreational preferences shift, this park has basically languished. In 2017, it became clear to our client group, the Fairmount Park Conservancy, the City of Philadelphia Parks and Recreation Department, and other partners, that this stranded asset required a vision worthy of its history and its strategic location. FDR Park, originally known as League Island Park, is 348 acres of former tidal marshes sitting at the very base of Philadelphia. To the site's north are the dense row home neighborhoods of South Philadelphia, famous for movies like Rocky and The Irishman, but they should also be equally well known today for the Southeast Asian and Central American immigrants that give the neighborhood its current vitality. Since FDR Park was first developed over a century ago, South Philadelphia has been the gateway neighborhood for immigrants arriving to Philadelphia. FDR Park provides a vital service connecting new residents with each other and with opportunities like an informal food market, recreation, and as a green refuge from the urban heat island effect. Because Philadelphia is projected to become a city of climate refuge in the future, we can imagine that these needs will not just continue, but will escalate. To the park's east is a sea of surface parking serving the 4 professional sports teams that also make their home in South Philadelphia. Just to the south, and separated from the site by the Naval Reserve Basin, is the 1,200-acre commercial redevelopment of the Navy Yard. While home to 15,000 jobs today, it is expected to grow to a community of 5,000 resident and 30,000 full-time jobs. Our site sits at the terminus of the Broad Street subway line and is ringed by highway and rail transportation. Yet, in sort of true Philadelphia style, over 70% of the park users are currently driving to the park. Until the turn of the 20th century, these tidal marshes were largely undeveloped. Hollander Creek and Shedbrook Creeks bisected the site and flowed into the back channel of the Delaware River, now the Naval Reserve Basin. It took vast quantities of fill generated by the construction of the Broad Street subway lines and the 150th anniversary of the signing of the Declaration of Independence to spur our city leaders to hire the Olmsted brothers, Frederick Law Olmsted's sons, to create a formal plan for League Island Park in 1914. The brothers' plan carefully separated the park from the city by depressing the network of lakes, carriage paths, and greenswards into a bowl, bisected by the extension of Broad Street. By 1926, the portion of the park east of Broad Street was absorbed into Municipal Stadium, which has grown into the Stadium District today. The next significant change to the park came in the 1940s, when 180 acres were added to the west, creating a municipal golf course. This investment reflected the recreational priorities of the city leadership at that time. In the 1960s, the southern portion of the park was lost to the construction of Interstate I-95. The practice of making ad hoc changes to the park has only increased. In the 1970s, the site received the fill from the construction of wastewater treatment plants. The shifting boundaries are evidence of the way FDR Park is viewed less as a network of systems and a platform for recreation, and more as a green void on the city's map, ready to absorb development schemes, infrastructure projects, or pet projects of well-connected individuals. Happily, many of the projects that have come to fruition at FDR Park were driven and led by a community of users. The famous skate park was built by hand in the 1990s. One of the region's best Asian markets draws visitors from New York to Maryland on summer Sundays. Ensuring that the park holds space for immigrants and Black communities, along with generations of Philadelphians who know this park from tailgating at football games, needed to be a priority of the master planning process. The boundaries of FDR Park have continually shifted to reflect the political priorities of the moment. Our planning process needed to firmly center residents in the conversation about the park's future. During the year-long planning process, the project team engaged over 3,000 community members and stakeholders, with FDR Park being one of the most heavily used parks in Philadelphia. The master plan process was structured to ensure that all park users and communities were invited and had the chance to weigh in on the future of the park. Yet, in order to deliver a vision for the park that has a viable pathway to implementation, The planning effort must leverage the reality that FDR Park sits at the confluence of major initiatives affecting the city's future. It was essential to be deeply engaged with the leaders of these initiatives beyond the Parks and Recreation Department. For example, the Pennsylvania Department of Transportation was critical to understanding how the future reconstruction of I-95 can repair damages from the 1960s, such as stormwater that greatly impacts the park today. The Philadelphia Water Department's Green City Clean Water program points towards in-park projects that may help meet Philadelphia's consent decree while improving water quality in the park. The plan needed to have a strong constituency of support across all agencies. Our vehicle to generate consensus and build support for the plan emerged out of the traditional engagement strategies like surveys, newsletters, and large-scale community meetings conducted across the city. Most of these activities were conducted in a minimum of 5 different languages that included interpretation and took place in cafeterias, rec centers, and schools most familiar to residents. Recognizing that many of our park users might be less familiar with the language of planning and design, we worked to create tools with like playing cards, play money, and markers and trace that allowed park users and agency stakeholders to play with and test various park planning scenarios, learning quickly that any solution is going to have to require compromise. What emerged from these activities was not a menu of options or a list of desires, which would have created clear winners and losers. Rather, by asking park users and our agency stakeholders to prioritize their needs, the planning team was able to identify a clear preference to prioritize nature and water over active recreational programming. This was a bit of a surprise, sort of contradicting the initial assumptions of the client group going into this planning process. In parallel to the development of the master plan, we invested in developing community capacity to steward the outcome of the plan, which is really important. This work consisted of building capacity and connection between the Friends of FDR, which is a nonprofit group, and the community of park users. We worked to identify and employ neighbors and users to serve as planning ambassadors who could also connect their on-the-ground knowledge of the park to the Friends group. Our team spent hours with the Friends group, diversifying and growing their membership, formalizing governance, and creating public calendars of meetings and programming. The goal was to ensure that the Friends emerged from this process with the bandwidth, skills, and membership to continue the community connections that the planning process initially forged. A park of this scale, with a diversity of programs and usership, requires active management in order to deliver a successful experience for all users. The planning effort considers the ongoing cost of operations, establishing a dedicated staff, and development of new revenue sources within the park boundaries. The first step towards achieving these goals began with the hiring of Philadelphia's first park manager, or dedicated park manager, at FDR in late 2019. Finally, the physical plan is aligned with a vision for public-private partnership led by the mayor of Philadelphia that shares the responsibility for driving investment to the site. Using the semi-sesquicentennial as a planning horizon, which is now the 250th anniversary of the country, which is now going to be in the year 2026, the partnership aims to grow the range of investors in this project beyond Philadelphia taxpayers, establishing a vision for FDR Park while creating shared stewardship among users, agencies, and decision makers is the true product of this process. It is this renewed sense of possibility that will shift the status quo. And as you can see here on the screen, the sort of very complicated implementation of the park that bundles certain projects, some of course needing to happen first in order to set up future conditions. So, what are some of the challenges that face the park today? And these challenges are really immediate as well as long-term. Immediate challenges include, financial funding is a critical issue because there are so many things that need to be addressed. There is the issue of infrastructure, not just roads with potholes, but utilities such as water and sewer infrastructure that's over 100 years old. There is litter throughout the park, but also dumping that occurs in certain areas underneath I-95. And of course, deferred maintenance and a lack of amenities such as restrooms and even basic places to gather and sit. There's no welcome center, and a lot of the users of the park are very siloed right now. So people come for one activity. So there's not, they come for one activity and then leave when that activity is over. So there's not a lot of cross usage between the different users. Although there are a lot of diverse users and a lot of diverse uses in the park. The park has not had this full-time dedicated maintenance staff, which you can imagine is quite a challenge for the park of 348 acres in size, until, as I just mentioned, they hired that park manager in 2019. So some of the long-term challenges that affect the park, certainly water quality is a key one. And I'll talk about the hydrology of the park in a minute. But the water features, including Edgewood Lake, the large iconic water feature seen in many photos, was originally designed as a shallow concrete-lined pool and areas for swimming. Those water bodies are now full of sediment, largely related to the amount of untreated storm water that's coming into the park, and even more shallow and subject to algae blooms. We have areas of flooding, especially in areas of high use, like the park's only playground near Meadow Lake, and some of the low-lying athletic fields that we have in the park right now. The golf course has historically had flooding problems since its construction in the 1940s. There's flooding near the baseball fields as well. So water is a critical component of the future of the park. FDR Park is very much a park built on and around water, so understanding the park's hydrology is critical in order to achieve an effective planning process. The park was originally tidal marshes that were filled in at the beginning of colonial times, but then continued through the 1900s with the construction of the park and eventually the golf course. You can see on the left the original Shedbrook Creek that running through the park and down through a sluice gate and ultimately out through a culvert that goes underneath I-95 through Hollander Creek culvert and through a tide gate into the naval basin, which ultimately connects to the Delaware River. On the right, when the park was designed, several lakes were created from the original Hollander Creek, including the Edgewood Lake that I mentioned a minute ago and the Meadow Lake, as well as the Pattison Lagoon to the north. They come together and exit through that same tide gate. So the whole park really kind of comes together in like the shape of a Y, and all that storm drainage exits out through the tide gate. But here's where it gets really complicated, because much of the park is actually located below sea level, as we can see on the next slide. So why does this park flood? Well, when it rains and the park receives a lot of runoff from upstream areas, as well as I-95, all that runoff comes into the ponds and streams and the creeks that I just mentioned, but the park itself is depressed and lower than the water level at high tide. As the water level rises up and goes out through the culvert under the Hollander Creek, there's a tide gate which is not in good condition. As you can see from this diagram on the far right, as the tide levels fluctuate, there are times when the water level in the naval basin and the river is higher than the park. So water comes into the park, but it can't get out except during a limited time window when the water level is lower than the tide gate. The park literally cannot drain. To further complicate things, the tide gate is not functioning well, and it doesn't close well because a lot of trash and sediment is blocking the flap gate. And so there's also issues of water coming into the other direction from the naval basin and the river and into the culvert and backing up into the park. So this entire system is in need of repair. We also know that shallow groundwater in the park is connected to and influenced by the river, so that even when we have the tidal influence, the groundwater, we can get flooding just from the groundwater as well. As you can imagine, climate change only increases the water challenges the park faces. One of the things that are worth pointing out is some of the unintended consequences the park will face with climate change. As an example, in New York City, which is only about 100 miles north of Philadelphia, after Hurricane Sandy, Central Park lost over 1,000 trees due to the impacts of salt spray. We know we will have higher water levels, as much as 2 feet in FDR by 2050 and maybe 4 feet by the end of the century, as well as greater storm surges. So the challenges of getting water out through the tide gate only increase. With the increased CO2 levels, we know that this will help the forest and the vegetation grow, but it'll also increase the growth of invasive species, which already plague the park. However, despite all these challenges, both current and future, there are also incredible opportunities and resources in the park, including the existing ecology. You can see from this figure the diversity of species you might encounter on a hike in the park. And some of the habitat that we're actually trying to design in the park to increase the amount of species that are currently there. FDR Park is an important bird area, as I mentioned at the beginning, as designated by the Audubon Society, with over 195 different species of birds that have been observed either living or migrating through the park. There is a variety of plants and animals, including 2 endangered species of plants and endangered animals such as the red-bellied turtle. It's an important place for wildlife observation, for fishing, for walking, and being in nature. So when we were developing goals for the master plan, we knew that the park users would come to know FDR Park as Philadelphia's centerpiece of recreation, art, ecology, and resilient design. In order to achieve this vision, the master plan focused on 3 goals: reclaim the vision, restore the function, and renew the impact of the park. The master plan reclaims the original vision of the park for a modern audience by working within the original framework and design intent of the Olmsted brothers. To restore the function of the park, the master plan leverages nature-based solutions such that the entire park can fulfill its promise as a critical piece of civic, public health, and ecological infrastructure. The master plan is driven by the knowledge that strategic investments in our civic assets can connect people of all backgrounds, cultivate trust, and counter the trends of social and economic fragmentation in cities and neighborhoods. To achieve these goals, the design team embarked on an urban ecological methodology called creative fitting. And simply stated, this methodology matches users' needs with environmental opportunities. Now, the measure of a successful creative approach is fitness, which is measured by the health and resiliency of the project's network of social, environmental, and economic benefits, which I'll discuss in just a few minutes. The FDR Park Master Plan brings nature, water, and human activity into balance in one unified system. Another way to define this is how we can find the balance between all the different competing interests in the park. Every square inch of the park is precious, and the list of programming needs determined through the community engagement process with the priorities that I mentioned before exceeded the amount of park space we had to work with. So we had to be creative in fitting together all the park programming so that they could all be mutually beneficial. So the existing plan today, as you can see from this aerial, the existing park really functions as 2 halves of one park, with the historic Olmsted Park to the east and the FDR Golf Course on the west. And in the bottom south there, you see a wooded area where a lot of that industrial fill was placed in the 1970s and 80s. Now, the golf course has been shut down for almost a year, which means that the western portion of the park has the potential to provide the future passive and active programming that we heard expressed through the community engagement process. Now, the master plan vision reflects a network of watercourses enclosed by swaths of reforestation, encircled by a network of trail systems and tree-lined parkways, framed by fields of active recreation. Playgrounds, restroom, picnic pavilions, overlooks, and concessions are systematically distributed throughout the park to enhance the visitor experience. Enhanced gateways, expanded event lawns, and increased programming activate the fields at the park's edge, while restored lakes, creeks, wetlands, and riparian reforestation provide an immersive nature experience with enhanced habitat connectivity at the park's ecological core, which you can see in this diagram here in the green, the middle portion of the park. So this ecological core contains some of the most iconic elements of the park, which are also the areas that are most susceptible to flood risk. The master plan recognizes this risk by increasing the park's capacity to manage water while simultaneously providing opportunities for the park users to connect with nature. Expanding the natural systems at the heart of the park improves the ecosystem services that the park offers to all the park users. And sort of pink or magenta around the outside is what we call the urban edge, and that encircles the ecological core and frames the perimeter of the park, providing an attractive and welcoming interface with adjacent communities. The urban edge contains a network of green stormwater infrastructure designed to manage runoff from the surrounding urban areas. Natural filtration systems ensure that the park can accept stormwater from the roadways without degrading the water quality in the park's lakes or impacting the park infrastructure. At a large scale, resiliency is defined by three basic principles that many of you may already be familiar with. But the first principle is the ability to maintain structure and function in the face of disturbance. So we accomplish that in many ways at FDR Park. First, the master plan will rebuild the tide gate to improve the water flow in the park and allow the park to drain faster after flood events. Secondly, the plan will manage unfiltered stormwater and manage all impervious surfaces, both existing and proposed, within the park with best management practices that exceed the Philadelphia Water Department's minimal requirements, which serve as a national model for stormwater management and resilient design. Thirdly, the plan will balance the cut and fill on site to allow certain parts of the park to flood and raise critical programming out of the floodplain. For instance, we can't have the recreation fields on the perimeter be high and dry if we don't do some of the wetland projects, widen Shedbrook Creek and create a sedge meadow to allow for additional stormwater storage while maximizing habitat and creating other recreational opportunities. So to dig a little deeper into this, the wetland project, which is just sort of to the left of this rendering over here, is an example of how the master plan really tried to find win-win scenarios while doing this creative fitting process and trying to find a balance between the different themes of water, nature, and activities. So the nearby Philadelphia airport, which is less than a mile away, needs to expand their runways and was looking for wetland mitigation site that we were able to accomplish or accommodate in our master plan. So the 45-acre proposed wetland expands our ecological core, provides a more natural, immersive experience for park users, and we were able to reuse the 330,000 cubic yards of cut where we had that fill from the 1970s that I mentioned, which is relatively clean fill. And we could place that along the urban edge to help elevate our playing fields and keep them out of the floodplain. Now, the second principle of resiliency is the ability to be self-sustaining. So first, the master plan provides opportunities for the park to generate its own revenue to help offset operations and maintenance costs, which is really the first park in Philadelphia to do so. So this is a really big idea. The master plan adaptively reuses some of the existing historic buildings in the park to help generate revenue and support park programming. The guardhouse along Patterson Avenue on the north will be converted into a welcome center with park information and concessions. And the old bathhouses, which used to be part of the swimming at the lakes by South Meadow Lake, will be converted to an area we call the porch, which you can see in this rendering. which is a new southern gateway to the park that repurposes the bathhouses for a potential restaurant overlooking the lake and a community-centered event space that anchors the Great Lawn, which is just to the north of these bathhouses. The master plan detailed a 10-year pro forma with a goal of minimizing the amount of tax subsidy required to operate the park. This is also really important because this would allow the Department of Parks and Rec to allocate funds to neighborhood parks in underserved communities that may not have the ability to create revenue or attract philanthropic investment of their own. So if they don't have to invest in FDR, they can save that money and invest in other areas that really need help as well. Secondly, the plan creates a strong coalition for the park, including the institutional, public-private, and park user partnerships to improve park stewardship in an integrated and inclusive manner. And lastly, the plan also increases ecological diversity and creates healthy ecosystems that support populations of native flora and fauna. And the third principle of resiliency is the ability to learn and adapt. So first, the plan outlines a formal governance strategy that articulates an equitable and sustainable matrix of responsibility across all parties, including a dedicated FDR maintenance staff that is flexible and responsive to changing conditions. Secondly, the plan ensures flexible programming to allow for changing recreation trends over time. Lastly, the plan encourages public health, both physical and mental, and we've certainly seen that during this year with COVID, and combats nature deficit disorder through recreational opportunities, including a network of multi-use and nature trails, multi-purpose fields and courts, and open spaces, as well as immersive natural areas for respite and relaxation. Parks improve people's lives and bring communities closer together. They're agents of social, environmental, and economic transformations. The revitalization of FDR Park is an important statement about the value of parks in sensitive environments and their ability to provide value beyond everyday programming and activities. The master plan uses an inclusive range of consideration, environmental, economic, and social, to maximize the benefits for the park and to measure the park's health and resiliency, as I mentioned, as part of this creative fitting process. So this process identified opportunities so that the balance could be found between competing park uses, such that the benefits would create the win-win scenarios for short and long-term life of the park that I mentioned with the wetland. Establishing a way of identifying all the benefits associated with each of the major projects within the master plan, while also keeping in mind their associated costs, provides a framework for setting up priorities and making planning and design decisions. So every move that the design team had to make needed to solve multiple challenges. And this matrix that you see up on the screen right now was a tool that helped us to identify the maximum benefits of each of these moves. So we really tested these throughout to make sure that we were creating these win-win situations here and that we didn't necessarily have park trade-offs that create sort of winners and losers, but really tried to create win-win situations. And this is that tool which we use to do that. Now, to conclude, I wanted to end with this quote from Janet Haas from the William Penn Foundation. Quote, "The FDR Park Master Plan represents the promise of forward-thinking reinvestment in our public spaces to help manage the effects of climate change, all while providing high-quality recreation opportunities and the chance for people from all across the city to spend time in nature." Thank you all very much for letting me share the resilient future of FDR Park with you today.